At last count, women hold fewer than 10% of the highest paying jobs in Canada, and only 3.5% of companies listed on the country's biggest stock exchange have a female CEO. The obvious question is, why? Why do women remain so badly represented at the top of corporate Canada? And more to the point, what can we do about it? You'll find the answers right here, thanks to years of independent research and personal insights from 50 female executives from across Canada, including some of the highest profile leaders in the country. Together, we expose the hidden rules that are holding women back in business. And we provide a revolutionary plan of action for women looking to get ahead and for organizations looking to make gender equity a reality. We're thrilled to confirm that early reviews have been extremely positive. In the kind words of RBC Board Chair Katie Taylor, The Invisible Rules is a must-read for any aspiring leader. It confirms that gender equity has become a fundamental and differentiating business strategy in today's complex environment, and goes on to provide a compelling framework for eliminating the barriers that continue to impede the progress of women to the C-suite. It's a framework we'd love to share with you on your personal path to leadership and the pursuit of gender equity.
Welcome to today's session, The Invisible Rules, Pursuing Gender Equity in a Post-COVID World. We're thrilled that you could all join us today. My name is Paul Harrietta, and on behalf of my co-author, Holly Catalfamo, and our wonderful panelists, Heidi Worthington, Sonia Baxendale, and Michelle Bannock, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast. We'd also like to thank Pacific Blue Cross for their generous support of today's event and congratulate them for their public commitment to equity and inclusion. They're a wonderful company and a valued partner. Our intent over the next hour is to consider how COVID has impacted long-standing efforts to achieve gender equity in Canadian organizations, and how we might want to rethink the largely invisible rules that have dramatically impacted the career prospects of women and other marginalized groups, for that matter, over the past 18 months, give or take. Holly and I will take a few minutes to summarize our research and provide a few readings from the book, and we'll then turn things over to our panelists to share their personal insights as successful leaders. And with that, I'd like to start with a short reading from the opening pages of The Invisible Rules. I think it will help to set the stage. Like it or not, there are two sets of rules that govern employment practices in corporate Canada. One set for men and one set for women. One set that continues to preserve a long-standing male power structure by assuring that the disproportionate number of men achieve senior leadership status and the big paychecks that go with those positions. And a second set of powerful, deeply rooted, and largely imperceptible rules that make the pursuit of senior leadership far more demanding and uncertain for aspiring women. Men get to be men. In a form of corporate Darwinism, women must adapt or die from a career perspective. We hope to change that. This book exposes the invisible rules and makes it easier for women to get ahead. More to the point, it will help senior leaders, and senior male leaders in particular, better understand the negative impact that their attitudes and actions continue to have on so many talented and ambitious women. Unintentional perhaps, but undeniable and increasingly indefensible. Let's face it, gender equity isn't a women's problem or issue. If women alone could fix it, they would have done so a long time ago. This is a business problem and opportunity that men and women can and must tackle together. This book was finalized during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, an unprecedented period of uncertainty and disruption. It's safe to say that organizations looking to survive, let alone thrive in the new world order, will need to adapt and change the way they operate. They will need to innovate and create efficiencies, and they will need to rely increasingly on their brightest and their best, regardless of gender. It really is time to throw away the old playbook, invisible rules and all, and make gender equity the strategic priority that it needs to be. And that is our goal, to make gender equity a compelling business priority as well as a social justice issue. As our introductory video noted, the book was written to explore two fundamental questions. One, why do women remain so badly underrepresented at the top of corporate Canada? And two, how can we fix the situation? Well, to find the answers, Holly and I went straight to the source. We interviewed 50 female executives from across the country, including today's 3 compelling panelists. Of interest, 13 of our leaders self-identified as intersectional candidates. Based directly on the rich and highly consistent feedback we received during these interviews, Holly and I were able to, among other things, identify a number of gender-specific biases and barriers, that is, again, the invisible rules, that simply make it harder for women to achieve senior leadership status than their male colleagues. And 2, to isolate 4 key strategies that aspiring female leaders can and have used to successfully navigate those barriers and to climb the corporate ladder more easily and rapidly. Holly will expand on these key findings and others in a few minutes. But what I found particularly interesting in retrospect is that this devastating impact that COVID has had on women was entirely predictable based on the input our leaders provided. Given the invisible rules, it's absolutely no surprise that, 1, a disproportionate number of women have self-selected out of the workplace, mostly because of pay disparities and family obligations. 2, many women have received lower raises and fewer promotions than their male colleagues over the past year. Men are promoted based on potential, while women are promoted based on proven performance over time. The K-shaped recovery is based primarily on academic achievement. Credentials, as we'll see, are essential to female leadership success. And 4, many women have used this opportunity, for lack of a better word, to abandon what are often toxic pipelines and to upskill in preparation for alternative career paths, typically with a new organization. So again, no real surprises. What's really interesting as well is that looking ahead, I think it's equally predictable based on the leadership feedback that 1, flexibility without guilt for both men and female workers will become the essential return to work strategy for progressive organizations. Unresponsive organizations can expect to see many of their ambitious and high-performing women jump ship once things stabilize. With a focus on credentials, women will continue to dominate university enrollments, particularly in the STEM disciplines. And 4, women will continue to launch and grow successful entrepreneurial ventures at accelerated rates. No doubt our panelists will touch on a number of these issues. But before I hand things over to Holly, I want to confirm that gender equity is a real passion for me, motivated primarily by my wife's difficult but ultimately very successful career journey. You can read about Mary in the book. I also want to acknowledge that the research opened my eyes as a man and prompted me to confront some of my unconscious biases and resulting behaviors as a former CEO and board chair. What I learned through the process is that most senior male leaders simply remain oblivious to the invisible rules that continue to hold women back. They're largely unaware of their personal gender-based biases, the overwhelming tendency for like to hire like, and the considerable disadvantage this lack of awareness creates for aspiring female leaders, especially during difficult periods like this one. COVID, for all its devastation and disruption, has given us a collective opportunity to spread the word, to help build essential awareness, equip aspiring female leaders to ascend the corporate staircase, and ultimately to inspire leaders, and male leaders in particular, to make gender equity a business priority, and for all the right reasons. And on that optimistic note, it's over to you, Holly.
Thanks very much, Paul. I want to thank you for that excellent introduction. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to Heidi, Sonia, and Michelle We're so honored that you're here with us today. I would also like to thank the 50 remarkable leaders, including our 3 panelists, who've helped make the invisible rules a reality, and for inspiring the next generation of female leaders to help change the world. I'd also like to share a reading from The Invisible Rules, from one of our leaders who spoke of the barriers she faced on her climb up the corporate ladder. I approached both my boss as well as HR about a raise and promotion after 10 years as a senior manager at a very highly regarded quasi-public sector organization. I vividly recall the comments made by the female HR manager I spoke with. She noted that I couldn't possibly be a valued employee if I could get away with working part-time, and as such, I didn't have much of a chance of getting a promotion. She then shared what she thought was helpful advice. This is not a good place for women to get ahead, but it's a good place to raise kids and take courses. So keep working part-time and have more children. What's so compelling to me about this leader's story is, like so many stories in the book, how relatable it is to so many people, including, in all honesty, to me. A number of people have asked me, what fueled your passion to co-author a book on gender equity? And much of my motivation came from my years of experience as an HR professional, but also from personal experiences. Early in my career, as an aspiring young leader, one of my managers, who also happened to be female and the hiring manager, asked me why I had applied for a promotion when I had a little one at home. I don't think you'll be surprised to know that they went with the other shortlisted candidate, who happened to be male. Despite the fact that he also had small children at home, I'm absolutely certain that he had not been asked the exact same question. Of course, that's only one of many of the biases that so many women face during their leadership journey. Throughout my career, I've observed inequities, many of which were unintentional, but nonetheless, these inequities stifled the careers of incredibly talented women who faced the invisible rules, holding back women from achieving their dreams. Now, working with my friend Paul, I found the opportunity to share their voices, and hopefully we're going to make a difference in this space. We would like to share some of the highlights of the important concepts we explore, including the 4 common biases that women face, the CAPS model, which is a framework to explain the strategies or factors that our 50 leaders attributed to their success, and a high-level overview of the solutions that organizations must consider in order to address gender inequity in their workplaces. Our leaders identified 4 consistent factors that made it hard for them to directly compete with men for senior leadership positions, especially during the current pandemic, as Paul mentioned. The 4 big biases include a general need to outperform men on a sustained basis. This is often referred to as the prove it again bias. The need to choose between likability and leadership, or the tightrope. The demands women face with respect to motherhood and other domestic responsibilities, referred to as the maternal wall. And a subtle tendency for some women to judge one another in the workplace, which becomes a tug of war. Now, our leaders shared with us how they were able to navigate the invisible rules and those big biases during their climb up the corporate ladder. They attribute their success to credentials, adaptability, profile, and support, what we now affectionately refer to as the CAPS model. Strong credentials give women credibility and a voice at the table. Credentials are the ticket to the dance. Adaptability provides women with the ability to balance stereotypically assertive behaviors, think male, with communal behaviors, think female. Now, as our leaders told us, adaptability is not always easy, but it's absolutely critical. Our leaders also spoke of the need to cultivate a strong profile or personal brand. And finally, they shared that their successes would not have been possible without considerable levels of support coming from their partners, their families, outsourced support like cleaning services, supportive workplaces, and of course, sponsorship. Individuals in their worlds that were willing to showcase our leaders' considerable talents and abilities. We'd also like to share some initial thoughts on how to level the playing field, according to our leaders. As you can imagine, they offered a range of key recommendations, including gaining genuine leadership commitment from those at the top of the organization, building a real awareness of the issues that are facing aspiring female leaders, changing talent management practices to ensure that they are genuinely inclusive. We also have to have a hard look at compensation, the pay gap, which continues to perpetuate inequities. And finally, organizations need to rethink their workplace practices, as Paul mentioned, to provide genuinely flexible workplaces where outcomes are measured and not the time of day you log in and log out. As Paul indicated, the pandemic has demonstrated that workplace flexibility is not only absolutely critical, but it's achievable and it's long overdue. Now, we're going to leave the discussion of quotas for another day and another time. However, both Paul and I agree that it's worth the conversation. I'd like to leave you with this thought, and I want to emphasize something that Paul has already mentioned. As you know, gender equity is no easy task, but it should not be seen as a women's issue. It is a business issue, and we need to address it as such. Gender equity is not something that women can fix all on their own, because if they had, it would have been solved a long time ago. It's time for men and women to make gender equity a strategic business priority, complete with methodology and metrics. Good intentions aside, nothing gets done when only half the population wants to get it done. I want to thank you all for allowing me to share. I'm now going to turn it over to Paul, who is going to introduce our amazing panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. It's been a true pleasure sharing the journey with you, and I look forward to continued discussions and opportunities to present like today. So at this point, I'm thrilled to formally introduce our remarkable panelists, and they are just that, remarkable. Heidi Worthington, I guess our host in many respects today, Senior Vice President and Chief Revenue Officer at Pacific Blue Cross. Sonia Baxendale, President and CEO of the Global Risk Institute in Financial Services, or GRI, lost my capacity to speak. Serial board member and former President of Retail Banking and Wealth Management at CIBC. And Michelle Bannock, a portfolio professional, member of multiple boards, and former Chief People Officer at OMERS. It's an incredible group, an incredible panel, and I, for one, can't wait to hear what they have to say. So, on to the questions. We'll start with you, Heidi. Why, in very general terms, do women remain so badly underrepresented at senior levels in corporate Canada?
So thanks for having me here this afternoon. I want to pull out 2 points from your question, Paul. And one of them is so badly underrepresented. In the opening video, there was the statistic for the top 100 TSX companies. 3.5% of them have female CEOs. I must admit, I find that really shocking, given that we're half the population is female. And I must admit, I spent about 10 years of my career overseas, And I was delighted to come back to Canada. And my impression and my experience in Canada is that we are more embracing of the female talents that we have in our societies as well as our organizations. And my experiences in BC, for those of us who are joining us from BC today, have been really positive. I thought that number would be higher in the province of British Columbia, and it is not. The source that I had is that 5% of CEOs of the top companies in British Columbia were female, which also surprised me. So clearly there's a really big issue. And I think it's because it's a really tough one to tackle because there's so many different dynamics as to why this is happening. And I think the book goes into quite a few of those different areas really well because there are quite a few. There's one that I really want to pull out, which is why I think this is so hard. And that is the fact that a lot of this isn't roaming around in the conscious mind. It's in our subconscious mind. It's how we were raised and what our perceptions are about the roles of men and women and how we assess people and judge them from just meeting them and what we see. And I have to make a confession. I feel very passionate about gender equity and empowering our female leaders. And I myself, 2 years ago, had a meeting with 2 consultants from Toronto. One was an older gentleman, very well dressed, quite articulate, and a much younger female colleague with him, stunningly, jaw-droppingly beautiful. My male colleague that was beside me, I kind of felt like I had to put his chin back up to, stop the drool from happening. She's gorgeous. And I remember thinking, wonder what she's going to bring to the table. And within the first 10 minutes, it was incredibly obvious that this woman was very talented, very bright and articulate. She's an actuary as well by background. And I remember digesting in that meeting going, I just did what we really don't want to have happen. I just judged her because she was female and stunningly beautiful. I wasn't sure what to expect from her intellectual capacity. Whereas I didn't question that from the older white guy in the suit. So even when you spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, the way that we're raised still colors how we perceive people. And we have to draw people to be more aware of that because it permeates in so much of what we do. So we have to call it out, and delighted to participate in your book to help bring it to the table. Because you'd think by now in 2021, we'd have this down, but we really clearly don't.
Excellent. Thank you. Holly.
Thanks so much, Heidi. And thank you so much for sharing your own experiences and how they have shaped your understanding moving forward. We're going to turn our next question over to Sonia. And Sonia, what we would like you to share with the panel, with the webinar, is how you view the pandemic in terms of how has the pandemic, from your perspective, revealed biases, barriers, and challenges that aspiring female leaders face.
Okay. I did not survive the not taking myself off mute here. Anyways, great question, Holly. So thank you. And first of all, Paul and Holly, thank you for taking on this very important task. It was a privilege to be one of the women who participated in the book, and thank you for inviting me today. I wanted to add to the question that Heidi was just answering. I was in a session earlier today, and on the number of CEOs in the TSX 60, there are currently 0. Coming out of the most recent proxy information. So having said that, I do think that progress is being made on many fronts, all too slow, but things are getting better. So in terms of the pandemic, I mean, the first thing I would say is the pandemic didn't create any of these problems. Much of what we have seen through this pandemic is an accelerated or an exacerbated situation of something that was already sitting at or below the surface. So the pandemic, much like crises before this one, has had a disproportionate effect on women. That is a very clear fact. And in ways that we haven't yet, I think, fully understood. Paul, you talked about a number of the ways. But we know that in excess of 60% of the job losses were jobs lost to women. of those women that didn't lose their jobs, they were disproportionately in roles that put them at risk. They were in healthcare, they were in, other retail positions, they were in branches of banks. It was all these jobs. So the women that didn't lose their jobs were in difficult roles. You layer on that the additional stress that women disproportionately bear, and that is the weight of being the primary caregiver, looking after their children, but not just looking after their children. As this pandemic attacked the aging, these same women were looking after their parents. They were dealing with all the challenges associated with trying to keep their parents safe. So, in short, the effect of the pandemic has been absolutely devastating for women in every way possible. I mean, no matter where you look, women have been disproportionately impacted. And I think we are going to see over time impacts from this that we haven't yet seen. And we're going to see that from mental health on women. We're going to see that from the physical impacts to women. We're going to see that from the women that choose to leave the workforce because it has become a burden that is too difficult. We're going to see the women who leave the workforce because they just choose to reflect on what matters to them in life and decide that they have to. We've just seen this to some extent with on the political front with McKenna, who's come out of this pandemic and said, you know what, I have an important issue I want to deal with, and that's climate, or two important issues, climate and my children. And so, all of these things are just enormous impacts that we're going to continue to see on women. Now, I don't want to just be entirely negative, as sometimes I can be, but I do think there is a silver lining in this. And that is that the issue is at the forefront. Organizations are going to have to address it, and they're going to have to address it for two reasons. One is there is going to be real economic impact to those organizations as a result of these actions on the part of women. But two, we have entered a period where there is a very different expectation on organizations and on governments in terms of how you bring people along and bring not just women along, not just gender diversity, but racial diversity, which, by the way, when we look at racial diversity, it too has a disproportionate negative effect on women. So, whatever corner you turn, you have a woman standing there. But I do think that we're going to see policies put in place more aggressively than ever. And we are at a potential turning point, and discussions like this and programs like this that you guys are bringing forward couldn't be better timed. And so I think there is opportunity, but there is no doubt that the impacts have been rather significant.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Yes, to your point, I think it's an excellent one, is that the pandemic hasn't created new biases. It's revealed and amplified biases that have existed for long periods of time and will impose on both individuals and organizations a need to respond in some meaningful way. And I think based on that input, that the strategies that our leaders adopted within the book to help manage the biases become that much more important as we move forward. So, Michelle, during the interviews, our leaders identified, as Holly mentioned, 4 consistent strategies to navigate key biases and barriers in the workplace. These were the credentials, adaptability, profile, and support, or the CAPS leadership framework. Given the recent indications that this K-shaped recovery appears to be influenced predominantly by educational qualifications, or at least qualifications as much as anything else, how essential are credentials to aspiring female leaders as we emerge from the pandemic?
Well, first of all, Paul, Holly, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. And Sonia and Heidi, I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel with you. And it's important to keep these conversations going. And so thank you for taking the time to continue to put these issues at the forefront, because as Sonia mentioned, these issues are at the forefront in many respects and need to continue to be. When I think about the employment recovery, it has definitely not been equitable. Between February of 2020 and May of 2021, employment rose by 6% for those with a bachelor's degree, as compared to a decline by as much as 12% for those with less than a bachelor's degree. We've already heard about the devastating negative impacts the pandemic has already had on women in the labor market during this time period. And based on that statistic, it appears as if credentials will be essential for female leaders, aspiring female leaders, existing female leaders now and for the foreseeable future. And while that statistic I shared is specific to educational level, female leaders are going to have to think across a spectrum of credentials. And Paul and Holly, you so eloquently outlined that in the book. And as I reflect on that, it really is going to mean a focus on finding the balance between demonstrating that they have the academic and technical credentials or competencies alongside the ability to influence and contribute to strategic conversations. In parallel, and maybe this is the opportunity, it's not necessarily easy, I also think that female leaders are going to have to get more comfortable with self-promotion. Male counterparts seem to have no issue with this. And I know personally throughout my career, this was something I struggled with greatly. It's going to mean creating narratives about the various credentials that female leaders bring to the table and their key differentiators. Practically speaking, each individual's approach to this will be unique, and it can be accomplished in a variety of ways. But as I was reflecting on wanting to share this point, a couple of things came to mind. First, I'd encourage female leaders to see opportunity where others don't. We are surrounded by business challenges regularly, constantly. Assess current business challenges and create the opportunities rather than wait for them. Step forward to highlight the value you can bring and how your credentials can be that differentiator. And the other thought I would share is about brand. So define your brand, own your brand. What's the paragraph that summarizes what you bring to the table? I've always struggled with the concept of an elevator pitch because brevity has never been my strength. So consider this your amplified elevator pitch.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate, and you can see that I'm smiling and I'm nodding when you're speaking, because your advice is so important for not only aspiring leaders, but those that are out there working as leaders, and the modeling that they can provide for all of us as we move our careers forward. So thank you very kindly. I really appreciate your advice. I'm going to turn my next question back over to Heidi. And Heidi, one of the things that we know, and one of the learnings that have come about because of COVID, is that employees and female employees want and need greater workplace flexibility. And we've spoken about that already today. Now, one of the leaders in the book calls it flexibility without guilt. So, how precisely can organizations make flexibility without guilt a reality?
Isn't that what we all want to aim for, really? That would be the ideal. And as Sonia and Michelle were talking about, this pandemic, as many negatives as it's brought, has brought really big opportunities too, because we just went through a forced social experiment about virtual working, which I can tell you most executives that I talk to never, ever thought that we could accomplish and business could still proceed with that type of work environment. So I think we've already pushed that pendulum all the way over and shown in most cases, not all, but in most cases, that we can actually work quite effectively virtually and flexibly, because most of the time, for not all of us, but for many of us, particularly in the corporate world, that work from home and that virtual work also came with flexible. That's not always the case, but being able to integrate your work responsibilities with your family responsibilities or your community responsibilities, or just frankly, your own morning workout or a lunchtime walk for your own health, I think has got a number of different advantages. And the same thing too with productivity, not having to commute. I'm quite fortunate. I don't have a really long commute, but I know a lot of my friends across the country have really long commutes. And so I think we've reaped a whole ton of productivity coming out of that. What is the answer to properly moving to a hybrid work environment? Because of course, I don't think all of us want 100% remote. We'd rather have some balance of it. I don't think we know that yet. I don't think anyone's really got that one down. And one of the things that I'm just so proud of Pacific Blue Cross, we've decided we're not going to call it yet. We're going to take the rest of this year and have different pilots and learn what is the best way to work moving forward. What is it that our staff really want to see from their leadership and want to work, how they want to work with each other? What is it that we think we need for the business? What is it that our members and our customers are looking for from us? And figuring some of that out with some pilots and some testing and some insight and data before we decide what we think is the best way to roll forward and excel in our area of service, which we do in health benefits here in BC. And I think that's going to be, I think, one of the things. We're going to have lots of social experiments going and we'll learn. But the biggest thing, I think, is allowing us to have that choice and trusting that we'll be productive. We know that's not a right. We know it's a privilege, but I really think that that flexibility is more than paid back with incredible productivity, loyalty, and trust that's built through better hybrid arrangements. So I'm really excited about what this is going to bring for the future of work that I think particularly benefits caregivers, working parents, working moms.
I love the fact that you started with the line that isn't that what we all want. And I think that's the key, is that, you know, there's been this perception, as we talked about in the book, that somehow flexibility to this point has been somehow an accommodation to women, when it really is about workplace integration, balance, whether you be male or female. And as long as our leaders are willing to demonstrate that and push these programs as employee programs rather than female programs, hopefully we'll see that uptake and proof of concept, as you mentioned. So it's fabulous. Great answer. Thank you so much, Heidi. I'd like to throw this out to all three of you now, get your perspectives. We'll begin with Sonia. And you touched on a number of these factors during your opening discussion, but as a senior leader, what other workplace strategies, that is beyond flexibility without guilt, do you recommend that organizations committed to gender equity adopt in a post-COVID world?
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, I think that there are still no shortage of things that organizations can do. But let me just touch on a couple of them. My view is that in any corporate organization, true systemic change has to happen from the top. So, and that really means from the board, the CEO, the senior leadership team. So I think one of the real starting points is that diversity and inclusion actually has to become part of the strategic prioritizations of the organizations. It has to be embedded at that level with explicit and clear commitments. And, you know, if we think about, and I know we're not going to go down the path of quotas, but just targets, most large organizations have now set policies and targets that they're public around for their boards. And we've seen huge progress at the board level, certainly not where it should be, but huge progress nevertheless. Where we haven't seen the same progress is at the executive level. We haven't seen the same progress. We've talked about the CEO numbers. If you do the same thing and you looked at named executive officers, very few women amongst those ranks. And so I think what we need from organizations, and one of the key actions, is to now move towards really making it a strategic priority, setting targets, incorporating it into compensation, and make it a core part of the leadership requirement. And that is really, something that the board has to lead in the organizations that they lead. I think the other thing is that boards and senior leaders really need to think more about their purpose. And, we've long really at boards and at senior teams really been driven to spend most of our time on short-term profits. I mean, that has really been the measure that we've been assessed by. And I think that there is a really a substantial sea change that has happened, and that employees, customers, investors, they're looking for something different. And I think this is sort of being encapsulated today in ESG broadly, and climate is a big part of that. But diversity is a very important part of this, and social justice, fairness. So I think there's an important role for boards and senior leaders to really reflect on how they rethink the purpose and the role of their organization in that context. And then just the one final thing that I would say, I loved what Heidi was saying in terms of a flexible work environment. And I think that that sounds like a great way to go. I tend to be a worrier. And I worry about flexible work environments not being a good thing for women, and not being a good thing for other disadvantaged groups, because it has the potential to take away our opportunities for visibility at the top. The things we always used to talk about, deals getting made on the golf courses, and you're not invited out to the lunch, and you're not at the drinks after work, and all those things that we, in the past used to say, though, we used to talk about those kinds of barriers. I'm just really conscious that we ensure, and you kind of touched on it, Paul, in terms of these need to be programs for everyone, not just for women. But I worry that women and, parents and those sorts of things, that those people take advantage of these potential opportunities, and others who feel less encumbered don't have to take advantage of those opportunities. And we create a new set of disadvantages through these choices that we give people. So that, I think, is we've got to really be thoughtful about how we move into this new flexible world.
Oh, wonderful, thoughtful response. Thank you. Michelle, do you have thoughts around that as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm just going to build on a lot of what Sonia has already mentioned, but I think that leaders and organizations need to think much more broadly about their responsibility for the whole human and whole health of their employees. Burdens are not borne equally across all women. And that existed before the pandemic, much like we've already said. A lot of these issues existed prior to COVID. The opportunity before us is actually to be more intentional in developing empathy, so we can better understand lived experiences and know how to support the women in our organization. So what does that flexibility need to look like? And how do we create brave and safe spaces for them to dialogue, so that we can learn about that and learn, what's getting better in the organization? What's getting worse? How does it make them feel? So many of the operating tenets and aspects of organizational playbooks were born out of the office setting, where people left their homes physically and went to work. We have to rewrite these for the current virtual moments that we're all living through, and equally for the anticipated hybrid moments to come. To an extent, reconstructing how we work so that life doesn't feel like a trade-off. I think for many women in organizations, it feels like a trade-off. They feel as if they have to decide between their careers and other important aspects of their life. So what if we reframed things and had these playbooks and these tenets create a space so that women know that they can be as ambitious as they want, and frankly, as ambitious as their male colleagues, and that the systems that guide decision-making won't work against them.
Excellent. Heidi, thoughts?
Yeah, just two things to add. Love those points, Michelle and Sonia. And you're right. I think from a leadership perspective, I definitely worry about providing the right leadership in a hybrid environment. I've had some exposure to that with a remote team before, many years ago in a global job, but not here in my role in BC and at Pacific Blue Cross. And one of the terms that I came across that I'll leave with you, because I was really reflecting on it, was this notion of participation equity. And the conversation was more so about having people virtual and in person for meetings and discussions and brainstorming sessions about participation equity. But I think in general in the workplace, I think that notion, we're going to have to really reflect on that as leaders to make sure that we're thinking those things through. So I think that's a lot of work still to be done and a lot of experimentation still. I think the one thing that I would love to add to what Sonia and Michelle have spoken about is really on formalizing development of high potential talent. And I mean that across the board, male and female. One of the things in the book that it does go into is a good discussion about quotas versus targets, getting what gets measured gets managed and what gets mandated gets done. I thought that was a fantastic quote in there. I think one of the things, though, that I also identified with is the fact that no one wants to think that they got the opportunity because they were female. You want to get the opportunity because you are the best person for that job with the skills that you bring to the table. So let's develop our leaders and our high potential talents and formalize those with the whole leadership, this executive team, to make sure that we're bringing the best out of the people that we have and that they know that we value them and we see lots of potential in them, and just make it more of a conscious thing instead of a thing that happens, to your point, in a side conversation late at night in the boardroom or over the golf course about who you think you're going to put into the next role. Let's just make this a little bit more purposeful and then equitable.
Excellent. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, and given our timing, I thought we might move to those quickly if that's okay, and then we'll just wrap things up with our final question with the group. The first one was to Michelle. And I think there's an old collegial tie here, but trying to shift an organization's culture towards inclusion and diversity without tokenism continues to be a challenge. How can we acknowledge privilege to amplify diverse voices from top down and bottom up?
That's a great question, and I want to build on something Sonia said earlier, because I fundamentally believe that this starts with leadership, and it starts with leadership at the top. And as Sonia suggested, I believe that starts with the board of directors. There are lots of structural elements that are at play contributing to this uneven playing field, and there are lots of these topics that are surfacing with an impatience for change. And frankly, I'm completely comfortable with that impatience for change. We've also surfaced a new, different language to address these topics. And so I think the board of directors has to lead by example by doing self-reflection and assessment at their level first, to demonstrate accountability and action, and then hold the CEO and the management teams accountable following on. It's shared accountability. It is about making sure that the voices that need to be heard are heard. So you have to have psychological safety in environments to have these conversations. And what I mean by that is how do you establish an environment of trust, openness, and respect so that people feel as if they can take interpersonal risk, right? And surface these conversations. So again, it starts with leadership at the very, very top of the house, because as a director myself, I'll often say to people, so if we don't think that people are paying attention, Never mind that stakeholders are paying attention. All of our employees are really paying attention. So I believe that that's where it needs to start.
Fabulous. Holly, quick question. Can you expand on the difference of male and female thinking under adaptability?
Okay. So Paul, are you putting that to me?
You.
Or okay. So, well, when we were thinking about, when we were interviewing our senior leaders in the Invisible Rules, one of the things that our leaders told us was that it was critically important for women to be able to navigate and we've been talking about this today, is that the expectations that individuals have for how a male, or what would be considered to be how a male might behave, that the behaviors, and how often females are judged quite harshly if they act in, and I'll use the language that our leaders talked about, which would be in an assertive way. So that whereas a male acting in an assertive way, that would be good job, that's a strong business person. Whereas if an individual were to be acting, a female were to be acting in an assertive way, they might be labeled in a less than flattering label. And I think we can all go where we need to go for in terms of how women are described in that regard. So the whole idea of adaptability is understanding how to demonstrate. And I apologize, I believe it was Sonia, you were speaking about how to make that compelling case for yourself as a business leader, and demonstrate profile, and to demonstrate how to be a business contributor, and at the same time to be true to your authentic self as a female, and not to be caught up in that dance of how people will perceive me. And we, I think, as organizations, and Michelle, you spoke very highly about how important it is to have that high level of trust to be able to have open conversations. I think that that's critically important for organizations to create that kind of an environment where we can, as individuals, be our authentic selves.
Okay. Question from one of our other 50 leaders. And this is open to any of the three of our leaders who want to take a shot at it, is can you speak to what women can be doing for other women to model, sponsor, and mentor, specifically as it relates to Holly's earlier comment about our tendency to judge and be hard on each other? How do we get out of our own way?
Well, I'm happy to jump in and take a crack at this, and I think women are getting better at this. I will say that in my early days in leadership, and I'm probably the longest in the tooth here of this group, but there were a lot of women that were happy to be the only woman at the table because it was part of a very exclusive club. And so there was some cachet in being there. I think that is long gone. And I think that in general, women have become far more supportive of women, but I think we just have to be so much more proactive about it. I think a lot of women leaders get a bit, now that I think they're over that hurdle, I think they get a bit nervous about looking to their male colleagues as if they are favoring women. And so I think that it's really important that women who are in positions where they can bring along other women, that they mentor them, that they coach them, that they sponsor them, that they put them forward. I mean, men have been doing this for male colleagues for centuries, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. I think it goes hand in hand with some of the comments that Michelle was was making earlier about being able to speak up on your own behalf and being confident. And I think we not only have to do that on our own behalfs, but do that for females within our organizations, and even, you know, referring women for positions when we know that there are opportunities in organizations. So I think that is the number one thing that women can do for women to help them move through the opportunities.
Great.
Oh, can I just add to that, actually? Because I actually think that we can also observe and amplify. So what I mean by observe is if you're a female leader in a room and you're a key part of decision making, take a look around. Are you the only one? And by that observation, find the opportunity to encourage other women at the table. And by amplify, let's assume there are multiple female leaders in a room. Amplify each other's voices. It really matters. Build on each other's comments and use that opportunity to lift all the voices at the time. And so observe and amplify are just a couple things I wanted to share.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Just given time, our last question actually anticipates the question we were going to leave you with anyway, the three of you. Our question was, as we emerge from the pandemic, what is the best piece of advice you can offer to women looking to reignite their careers? This particular question is, what steps or recommendations would you offer for women working in an organization where there is a clear gender divide? So why don't we start with you, Heidi? Pick one of or both of those questions, or merge them as you see fit.
Thanks, Paul. I think particularly meaningful for me through the CAPS framework is really the first one about being confident in your own credentials. I really think that that's one of the things that I think women also can really help other women with, is be confident with it. I found even for myself, often I would think, well, why me? Someone else is going to have more experience or more credentials or whatever that might be. And I had to flip in my head to say, why not me? And if I started from that perspective of why not me, then I could actually have the confidence to navigate, I think, a bit better about what my own ambitions were and what I thought I could bring to the table when opportunities came up. So that is one of the things for the C I would add then, is the why not me. And then the second one is S, which is support. I've been delighted with the number of up and coming leaders who have said to me, you know, could I ask for your help? Could I have a conversation with you? As well as some of the formal mentoring that I do with our local UBC here. And I've always been delighted to hear from them, and really proud of them for stepping up and owning it and asking. And I think more women need to step up and ask for help with some of these things. Most people are quite happy. We used to call it a coffee chat. It might be a Zoom call now, whatever that might look like, but is really just reaching out. And I think women will be quite delighted with how forthcoming other leaders, peers, members around you will come to support you. And then you also really see who are your real supporters, because they'll be happy to do it.
Great. Sonia, thoughts?
I'm going to be really short. I agree wholeheartedly with what Heidi's just said. And I'm just going to say, be an active agent of change right now. I think leaders are listening. It's a moment in time, and women need to speak up and be heard. And I think that we do have a unique opportunity. And so I encourage all of our participants to take that opportunity.
Fabulous. Michelle, final word to you.
So my advice today is something I mentioned earlier. Get comfortable and focus on self-promotion and see opportunities where others don't.
Fabulous. So on that wonderful note, regrettably, we're at the close of today's session. And I hope that our audience members, and thank you for joining us, found it as instructive as we did. We'd like to thank our remarkable panelists for sharing their candid insights and personal experiences, and for serving as wonderful role models for next generation leaders. I'd like to thank Pacific Blue Cross for their continued support and vocal advocacy for gender equity. And a special shout out to Nick and Carol for helping to arrange and promote the session. And I just would leave you with this thought that this is very much a passion project for Holly and me. We encourage you to read the book, and we ask you to reach out directly if there's any opportunity for us to share the work with your organization. Any luck, we'll be able to bring a number of these wonderful leaders along with us for the discussion. So with input from 50 senior female executives, the Invisible Rules, we think, provides a nice blueprint for aspiring leaders looking to advance their careers, and just as importantly, for organizations committed to gender equity. So happy reading. Thank you all for joining.